It started with a sealed box I was not supposed to find. I had been combing through the holdings of the Vermont State Archives on an unrelated assignment researching 19th century child labor practices in textile mills, when a mislabeled inventory ledger led me to a forgotten storage shelf in a climate-controlled vault. The box was tucked behind a row of unremarkable probate documents. No barcode, no accession record. Just a grey archival container marked Stillwater Hollow, Lowell Tract, 1874 to 1891. The name did not mean anything to me at the time. Lowell was just another patrician surname in a state overflowing with them. But something about the way the box had been hidden, its lack of digital presence, and the careful handwriting on the label, neat but strangely uneven, as though written under duress, kept me from walking away. I carried it to the reading room and signed the manual ledger with the time. The clerk barely looked up. Inside, there was no order, only scattered personal effects. A rust-flaked scalpel, a charred ledger book, a child's drawing of a church with no doors, and several small envelopes of brittle photographs. Most of the images were washed out, except one, a sepia-toned shot of a long, low building surrounded by trees, taken from a strange distance. The structure had no signage, but there was something disquieting about its proportions. Its roof sagged slightly at the center, and a dozen dark window panes stared out like sunken eyes. Beneath it all, folded several times and sealed in wax, was a letter addressed to Dr. Lowry, Vermont Medical Examiner, confidential. It was unsigned. The ink had faded, but the final line was still legible. I remember sitting back in the library chair, skin prickling in the artificially chilled air. There was no context, no date, but the letter, even in its vagueness, carried a tone of desperation that set something off in me. I'm not prone to gut feelings. I was trained to follow documentation, paper trails, census logs. But I had the immediate, irrational impression that I had stumbled onto something that did not want to be found. That was in February. By March, I had filed 2 information requests with the Department of Historic Preservation. In April, I was driving north to the town of Stillwater Hollow, a place that barely existed on contemporary maps. The Lowells, I soon learned, had been one of the region's foundational family's wealthy textile magnates, who rose to prominence during the waning decades of the colonial era, and established their legacy through a series of philanthropic endeavors: a public library, a mental hospital, an academy for girls, and, most prominently, the Lowell Foundation Orphanage for children of the Northeast. The orphanage, built in 1831, had been shuttered in 1952 after a fire. It had never reopened. The foundation, however, remained active, a sprawling non-profit with dozens of named initiatives, endowments, and satellite chapters across New England. Its mission was to serve those left behind. The language struck me as oddly archaic. The town of Stillwater Hollow had changed its name twice, first in 1913, then back again in 1971, for reasons no one in the local records office could explain. Much of the original Lowell estate was now wooded land owned by a conservation trust, but the remnants of the family compound remained. A brick chapel, a crumbling wall, and the ruined shell of the orphanage. I arrived just after sunrise. The road that led into Stillwater was narrow and curved sharply around a ridge, opening suddenly onto a low valley thick with pines. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the kind of quiet that came from isolation, but the hollow, pressure-like silence that exists in places where people used to be. The remains of the orphanage were fenced off. I parked on the shoulder and walked up the path. The fire had gutted the roof, and much of the interior was collapsed, but the foundation remained. Massive stones, blackened in places, held the footprint of the structure like fossilized bones. On the front lawn, there was a rusted sign half swallowed by underbrush. The inscription was nearly gone, but I could make out a Latin phrase. Fiat tenebrae. Let there be darkness. That night, I stayed in a roadside motel 15 miles south. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, unsure why the phrase unsettled me so deeply. It was not until the next morning that I connected the name. Lowell. A prominent American family, yes, but not just in Vermont. I ran a database search on regional philanthropic families from the colonial and Gilded Age periods. The name appeared over and over again, not just in Vermont, but in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, parts of Maine. Textile barons, mill owners, board members of early eugenic societies, sponsors of several mental hygiene institutions, always under different branch names, but always connected by blood. Stillwater Hollow was the root. What drew me in further was the pattern I began to see. Wherever a Lowell Foundation had been established in the 1800s, there were gaps in the record's missing census counts, unexplained deaths, abrupt property sales. I cross-referenced the years with regional newspaper archives and noticed another disturbing consistency. Children vanishing from poor neighborhoods, particularly orphans, runaways, and those with no formal guardianship. No names were ever confirmed. Just hints, obituaries of grieving parents, editorials about the rise in vagrancy, lists of boys and girls sent away to the country. Then came the first real break. A historian from Norwich University, Dr. Everett Winslow, returned my inquiry. He had researched the Lowell family extensively for a book that was never published. When I asked why, he responded with a brief message. It was not just fear. It was disgust. He agreed to meet me at his home. His tone was clipped, and he made it clear he had little interest in helping me reopen what he called a wound that has no bottom. But when I mentioned the orphanage and the Stillwater records, something in his demeanor changed. He grew quiet, then told me about a series of notebooks that had been removed from the Norwich archives under unusual circumstances. They had belonged to a man named Elias Dunning, a groundskeeper and part-time bookkeeper for the Lowell Foundation in the 1880s. One notebook remained in Winslow's possession, passed to him unofficially. It had never been digitized. Dunning's entries began as dull administrative notes, wood purchases, repair schedules, daily weather logs. But by the middle of the third notebook, the entries turned erratic. June 3rd, 1884. They brought another in at dawn. No name on the intake form. Said he was mute. He would not go near the chapel. Sister Claret insisted he was born wrong. I saw no wrongness, only fear. I copied every line. Dunning vanished from public records in 1885. No obituary. No grave. His last recorded address was on the edge of Lowell land, where a greenhouse once stood. By the end of that week, I had compiled over 100 pages of cross-reference material. Too much to make sense of in isolation, but the shape of it was beginning to emerge. This was no singular incident. It was generational. The Lowell Orphanage had been a front. That much was clear. But for what? The words used vitality, drawn, decay, suggested something medical. Or worse, the next step would be to trace the evolution of the Foundation's practices after the fire. I needed to find out what happened to the remaining family members, and why every single photo I could find of the Stillwater Chapel had its windows blackened, even in daylight. And I needed to know what exactly lay beneath the altar that made children scream. The floor plan of the Stillwater Orphanage was archived in the Vermont Historical Architectural Registry. It had not been digitized, but a clerk in Montpelier allowed me access to the microfiche copy. According to the earliest blueprints, the building was 2 stories with a partial basement, nothing unusual for the time. That something was wrong. The 1831 plan showed a sublevel beneath the chapel that did not appear in later iterations. It was labeled simply as Lower Hall. No dimensions, no features. Just a shaded square beneath the altar room, without a single point of entry from the rest of the structure. That room was absent from the 1857 renovation, scrubbed clean from the drawings. I made a digital composite of the overlays. What became evident was not just that the lower hall was concealed, it was replaced. The stone vault on which the chapel now stood was poured over the original foundation. A second skin, cast to hide what had come before. I reached out to a forensic archaeologist I had consulted during a past case involving old hospital grounds. Her name was Rena Talcott. I sent her the composite with no context, only the architectural dates and a note that I was investigating a potential historical anomaly. When she called me 3 days later, her voice was stiff. She told me the straighter alignment looked purposeful, not accidental. She said it resembled a method used in grave concealment, where a false foundation was poured over an original burial site to mislead excavation records. Then she asked, half-jokingly, if I had discovered a crypt. I did not answer. That night, I printed every known image of the Stillwater Chapel. Only 5 photographs existed from before the 1952 fire. Each showed the building from a distance, surrounded by heavy trees. In all 5, the windows were either shuttered or artificially blackened. Not a single image offered a glimpse inside. I enlarged one photograph and increased the contrast. In the shadows behind the window panes, the pattern of something circular began to emerge. Not a shape or design. I filed a Freedom of Information request for the Orphanage fire report. The response came 2 weeks later. The file had been sealed due to historical confidentiality concerns at the request of the Lowell Foundation. That was my first official dead end. But unofficially, a former fire marshal named Joseph Helder responded to a discreet inquiry. He had been a junior investigator at the time, present during the aftermath. Helder, now in his 80s, told me over the phone that he had always believed the fire was deliberate. Not an act of arson, exactly, but one of finality. His team had found scorched marks that ran in a ring around the altar, as though something had been drawn in accelerant. There were no surviving records of casualties, though he remembered bodies, children's bodies. But no autopsies were ever performed, and no remains were sent to the local coroner. He said they were taken away by the foundation. I asked him how many. He hesitated before answering. He said he had counted 29 small white sheets laid out in a row, but no ambulances, no mourning families. Only black cars, waiting at the edge of the woods. I remember standing at my window after that call, looking out at the tree line across the street. I had lived in cities all my life and never feared silence. But that night I kept the television on at a low volume. Not because I was afraid of being watched, but because I was afraid I would hear something. The next document that changed everything came from the Concord Historical League. An anonymous donor had recently turned over a sealed cabinet that had belonged to Dr. Bernard Whitlow, a psychiatrist, an early Foundation board member. The cabinet contained a collection of private papers, most of them dull, correspondence with governors, reports on mental hygiene programs. But one folder green, unmarked, held a series of typed transcripts. Each was labeled with a first name, an intake date, and a status. The names were children. Subject, Lena, last name unknown, intake year, 1886. Observation number 4. Girl continues to speak to unseen others. Claims they live beneath the red room. Refuses chapel bread. Skin shows signs of advanced dermal blanching. Possible dietary. No parents or sponsors located. Transfer to lower hall recommended. Subject, Calvin Morey, intake year, 1888. Observation number 9. Boy exhibits hypographia. Drawings consistent. Spirals. Inverted limbs. Fractured suns. Chapel attendance discontinued after seizure episode. Dr. Tillinghast advises extraction of molars prior to ritual compliance. That last phrase, ritual compliance, was circled in pencil, with a note in the margin. Check with parish for procedural limits. At the bottom of the stack, I found a hand-drawn map. It was not of the orphanage. It was of the land beneath it. The map showed a radial pattern, 3 concentric rings with narrow hallways stretching outward like veins. The innermost circle was marked with a single word, scrawled in dark graphite. Cradle. In the days that followed, I reached out to every descendant of the Lowell family I could identify. Most were scattered, living under new surnames, employed by banks, universities, or consulting firms. Some responded tersely, stating they had no knowledge of any orphanage. One person hung up as soon as I said the words Stillwater Hollow. But a single man, calling himself Jonathan Price, almost certainly a pseudonym, agreed to meet me in a parking garage in New Haven. He refused to be recorded. What he told me was fragmented, bordering on incoherent, but there were phrases I wrote down as fast as he said them. He said there were 5 families originally. The Lowells were just the caretakers. That the children were not sacrificed, they were fed forward. That something was being kept under the chapel, and that the fire was not meant to destroy it, but to weaken its bindings. I pressed him, asking what it was. He said it was not human, but had been once. That its body was gone, but its hunger remained. And that each generation, the foundation refined the process, made it cleaner, institutionalized it. First the orphanage, then the sanitariums, then the group homes. He said the foundation owns an organ preservation lab now. He did not say where. He begged me to stop digging. But I had already begun to dream of the spiral halls. I saw children wandering in endless stone corridors with no exits, each carrying a single tooth. Always a tooth. And always the sound of dripping from somewhere below. The final confirmation came from a university medical library in Philadelphia. I requested a scanned copy of a withdrawn monograph written by Dr. Theodore Tillinghast, the same name mentioned in the Whitlow transcripts. The document was titled, A Study in Continuity, Notes on Neural Extension in Pre-Death Tissue, 1883 to 1901. It was written in the language of scientific inquiry, but its conclusions were grotesque. Tillinghast believed that the human soul, or what he referred to as the living thread, could be tethered through a combination of endocrine withdrawal, sacramental immersion, and symbolic repetition. In his view, death was only a surface phenomenon. He theorized that the spiritual residue of a body could be suspended, even redirected, through what he called ritualized extraction. Each generation, the foundation improved the technique. They began with children because, as Tillinghast wrote, the flame is still loose in them, unbraided, easier to gather. This was not science. It was a theology of vivisection, and it was not abandoned. The Foundation's tax filings showed continued funding for biomedical facilities in 3 states, all with opaque research portfolios and undisclosed board members. Stillwater Hollow was the origin, but not the end. Next, I would return to the ruins. The map had to mean something. The chapel's altar was not symbolic. It was architectural. A lid. If what the document suggested was true, the Foundation had not simply buried a crime. They had built a system to keep it alive. Someone had been here before me. The stones were colder than they should have been. I remember that clearly. Even after a humid July day, the base of the chapel radiated a subterranean chill, as if the earth itself was exhaling upward. I walked the perimeter slowly, referencing the map from the Whitlow folder. The proportions aligned. The walls above were cosmetic. What lay beneath had dictated their arrangement. There was no access hatch, no stairwell, but the center of the building, Directly beneath the cracked marble altar rested, over the spot-marked cradle. I crouched and brushed away the moss and sit along the southern edge. A seam. Barely perceptible, but real. Someone had once pried this open. There was a moment where I hesitated, not because I feared what I might find, but because I feared the confirmation. That I was not chasing fragments or folklore, but a structure of cruelty as old as the nation itself, dressed in philanthropy, calcified into ritual, disguised as care. The floor gave way after a firm push. A slab shifted with a grinding groan and revealed a narrow chute, brick-lined, descending into a blackness so complete, it seemed to drink the light from above. The air that came out was neither stale nor fresh. It was wet, saturated, like the inside of a long-sealed lung. I climbed down. The ladder was iron, rusted to flakes. I moved slowly. After 15 feet, my boots touched stone. The passage widened into a chamber that should not have existed. The floor was earthen, but tamped hard, and the walls curved. Not square, not aligned to the chapel, but circular, like the rings of a tree. Ahead, a hallway stretched outward in both directions, lit faintly by my flashlight. I tested each step before I took it. The air did not shift. There were no sounds, until I heard the breath. Not human, not quite. It came not from behind or ahead, but beneath. A slow, wet inhalation, like a lung dragging itself open in syrup. Then silence again. I forced myself forward. The walls of the corridor were etched with lines, shallow, repeated grooves. At first, I thought they were damage. But then I saw the pattern. Spirals within spirals, thousands of them, carved by hand. Some small as thumbnails, others wide as cartwheels, all of them coiling inward. In the first chamber I found the bench. Iron straps, chains bolted to the stone, grooves in the floor for drainage. Next to it, a tray of tools, scalpels, hooks, a single curved bone needle. I thought I was prepared, but seeing the tools in situ, rusted yet intact, proved something I was not ready to admit aloud. This was not some folkloric horror buried in time. This was a room of use, not abandoned, preserved. I took photographs. Not for publication, I already knew this would never see print, but for memory, in case I did not come back. Further in, I found the mural, painted in iron oxide blood. If I had to guess an egg tempera, it covered the entire back wall of the chamber. A shape loomed at the center, humanoid but inverted, with limbs arched backward, and the head extended like a root system. It was faceless. Beneath it, dozens of tiny figures lay in rows, their bodies half subsumed into the floor. Not old, not decades gone. Someone had been here in the last year. I climbed out of the shaft in a panic, skin slicked in sweat, limbs shaking. Night had fallen fully. I drove 6 miles before pulling over and vomiting into a ditch. My hands would not stop shaking for the rest of the drive home. The next day, I received an envelope at my home address. No return name, no postage. Just the phrase, "You should not have gone down there," printed across the seal. Inside was a single item, a Lowell Foundation brochure, printed in glossy black, advertising their new biomedical research wing. It had opened the same year the fire inspection report for Stillwater Hollow was sealed. I went back to my notes, trying to establish a timeline, how the foundation evolved its methods. The pattern was consistent. Each generation refined the practice, moved it further from scrutiny. First the orphanage, then the asylums, then homes for the feeble. When that language became politically toxic, they shifted into neurology and youth cognitive research. The records were buried deep in non-profit labyrinths. I found one document from 1973, that described a trial in post-mortem electrical continuity performed on subjects obtained from closed-circuit partner facilities. No further explanation. I contacted a medical ethicist who had previously investigated misconduct at a cryogenics institute. In August, I located the last living Lowell by bloodline, Agnes Lowell Pritchard, age 92, residing in a private eldercare facility outside Portland, Maine. I requested an interview. The staff denied it. When I inquired further, I was told she had been transferred. No forwarding address, no discharge notice. Her room had already been cleaned. But an aide, clearly troubled by something, slipped me a photograph as I left. It showed Agnes in a wheelchair, seated before a portrait of her ancestor Silas Lowell, founder of the Stillwater Orphanage. The painting showed him with one hand raised, palm outward, in a gesture of benediction. But the aide circled something in red on the back of the photo. Silas had 6 fingers. And in the mural beneath the chapel, the central figure, whatever it had once been, had 6-fingered hands. This was not spiritual metaphor. It was lineage. Stillwater was not a deviation. It was a design. I began cataloguing every known Lowell site. Their names remained on hospital wings, university scholarships, neuroscience labs. The foundation was active in 6 states, with international partnerships in at least 2. And in every location, the same pattern emerged. Missing public children, discontinued programs, sealed reports. I made a list of all the places I had yet to search. I realized the list was growing. It would not stop. The fire was not an ending. It was a pivot. That realization came while reviewing property transfers in Montpelier's legal archives. In 1953, exactly 1 year after the Stillwater Hollow fire, a deed transferred the surrounding 40 acres to an entity known only as the Lucent Benevolence Trust. That name never appeared in foundation tax records. It never appeared in Vermont state business registries. But the address linked to a building I had seen once before. A black stone structure on the edge of Rutland, near the old quarry line. It had no signage, no windows, no public entry. I had passed it once years, earlier during an unrelated investigation, and assumed it was a data storage facility or secure records site. It was neither. Through a combination of FOIA requests, newspaper obituaries, and a trove of quietly indexed civil engineering contracts, I uncovered what the structure was originally commissioned for: archival preservation of sensitive psychiatric documentation. The name of the commissioning body had been redacted in every copy. The facility was completed in 1955. It was built on top of a filled-in shaft, the last of the drainage systems from the original Stillwater Orphanage tunnels. In other words, the Rutland structure was the seal. The foundation had not buried their past. They had built over it. I drove to the site. There were no fences, no guards, only a steel-plated door recessed into a concrete frame. An intercom panel was bolted to the wall, crusted with lichen. I pressed it once. Nothing. Again. Still nothing. Then a faint click. No voice. Just the door unlocking. Inside, the air smelled like formaldehyde and soldered metal. The fluorescent lights flickered weakly, illuminating a long, low hallway lined with beige laminate cabinets. Each bore a printed label. E. Somatic compliances. C. Early failures. T. Ritual deviations. Alphabetized, categorized, and meticulously stored. I was trespassing. I knew that. But the door had opened. I opened one drawer at random. Inside, a case file, its manila edges discolored by time. Subject: Peter L., age 7. Transferred 1949 from a closed home in Connecticut. Under outcome, a rubber stamp. Unviable. A handwritten note in the margin read: Absorption incomplete. Left hand calcified. Entity rejection. Another drawer held only tapes reels of grainy 8mm footage. Children sitting still in rows. A metronome ticking in the foreground. No sound, just faces. Blank, unblinking, waiting. Some were missing eyes, or teeth. All wore the same smock. I took nothing, only notes. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped my pen. One final drawer, near the back of the archive, bore no alphabetical label, just the number 0. Inside was a bound ledger. Leather, unmarked. I opened it. The contents were handwritten. Every entry in the same looping, inhuman script like someone had imitated cursive without understanding its purpose. The dates spanned centuries. Not years, centuries. The earliest marked 1721. The latest, 2019. Each page documented an offering. Not a child, not a name, just a trait. Temperance, recalcitrance, excessive dreaming, skin marked with stars, speech without breath, fear without memory. I turned to the end. The final entry had no date, only a word, seeded. Next to it, a photocopy of an infant birth certificate. Illegible, overexposed. The only legible line read, Lowell Foundation, Child Development Research Division. Site 4. It was not over. It had only branched. I left the facility with no incident. The door locked behind me. The forest was quiet. Back at home, I began comparing those traits to the intake logs I had compiled from Foundation-affiliated programs. There were subtle indicators language around atypical cognition, pre-speech neuroactivity, or excessive waking imagery. All vague enough to pass scrutiny. But once I knew what to look for, the pattern was clear. They were still selecting, still cultivating. The rituals had changed shape, but not purpose. I turned to the journals of Elias Dunning again, the ones smuggled from Norwich. A single phrase returned again and again across the final entries, always in Latin. Corpus intactum, lumen transitum. I had previously translated it as a crude spiritualism. Intact body, transited light. But I brought it to a Latinist, who offered a darker reading. The body endures. The light has passed. It was not about preservation. It was about channeling. I interviewed a retired neurologist who once worked for the Lowell Foundation's Neuro Youth Advancement Center in Concord during the 1980s. He spoke only under condition of anonymity. He claimed he had left the position after witnessing what he called undocumented procedures performed on sedated children. He described something he called the transference chair, a biofeedback device hooked into EEG and galvanic skin response monitors. That the children were not being tested, they were being used to modulate the brain waves of another patient in a sealed adjacent room. He said the goal was to create a resonance. I asked him with what. He only said, it was not alive. But it responded. Weeks later, I received an unmarked USB in the mail. On it was a single file, a grainy video clip. It showed a woman, late 30s, restrained in a medical chair. Her pupils were dilated to black coins. Her mouth open wide. A soft, rhythmic drumming played in the background, like heartbeat recorded underwater. Then her voice. The light is not theirs anymore. It has roots. It is eating down. The screen went white. I ran audio analysis. No matches, no metadata. The footage had been scrubbed, but I recognized the pattern behind her. The same spiral motif etched into the still water tunnels, repeated across the walls like a signature. I went to sleep that night with every light on. I do not remember dreaming. only waking with my hand clenched around my own wrist so tightly the skin had bruised. I am a rational investigator. I document, I cross-reference, I confirm. But I have come to believe this cannot be traced entirely in paper. The foundation, or what it has become, does not just preserve the past, it houses it, like a parasitic memory, transmitted across generations not only through blood but through sites, through ritual structure, through the stone itself. Stillwater was the origin, but I am now certain there are others. I have names. I have coordinates. One of them is beneath a school in Pennsylvania, another beneath a retirement clinic in Oregon. All share the same blueprints, each with a chapel, each with a lower hall, each with an altar that is not ornamental. What was born beneath Stillwater was not a singular entity. It was a template, and it is not dormant. I made the mistake of thinking I had reached the end, that all that remained was synthesis, distillation of findings into a single coherent narrative, something that could be printed, footnoted, archived. But truth resists conclusion, especially when the thing you are studying does not stop when you stop watching it. It was late September when I noticed the photographs had changed. Not drastically, not at first, just a subtle difference in the light images I had taken at the Stillwater site now showed an ambient glare where none had existed before, as if something luminescent were bleeding up through the foundation. In one image, barely perceptible behind a cluster of pine trees, a shape stood, upright, tall. I checked the original negative. The figure was not there. The implication was simple and unbearable. Someone or something was watching me. I began receiving emails from closed servers addresses with foundation suffixes that no longer resolved. Each message contained a single sentence. It remembers you. At first, I thought this was intimidation, a crude warning from someone inside the Lowell network who had discovered my investigation. But the language felt ... colder, not human in its cadence, not a threat. A fact, it remembers you. That was when I began reviewing my own medical records. I do not know what made me do it, perhaps paranoia. Perhaps the part of me that had begun to suspect that memory itself was no longer reliable. What I found confirmed my worst fear. I had been a ward of the state for 6 months in 1987, following the death of my parents in a fire. A fire I had no memory of. I had always believed I had been placed in a private foster arrangement through relatives. But the paperwork told a different story. My interim placement had been through a now-defunct care facility in Maine Elmbridge Youth Development Center, a subsidiary of the Lowell Foundation under a different name. I traced the address. It no longer existed. The lot was paved over. But aerial photographs from the late 1980s showed the same layout. Chapel, ring road, lower structure. I do not remember those months, but I have a scar on the inside of my jaw, one I had always assumed came from a fall. Dental records show that my first set of adult molars were removed surgically. No medical justification. I had been part of it. Somehow. The journalist in me wanted to stop there, close the file, burn the research. But the other part, the one that had climbed into the Stillwater tunnel, had touched the cold stone of that altar needed to go further. I began mapping current foundation-linked facilities. There were 19 active sites across 6 states. 10 featured known underground vaults. 4 were flagged for cognitive development research. 3 were located near natural cave systems. I chose the one in Pennsylvania, Ashbridge Institute for Neurological Advancement, located outside Reading, built atop an abandoned coal town. I did not go alone. I contacted a friend in academic cartography, someone who owed me a favor, and asked her to come with me, under the pretense of researching Civil War-era mining operations. She agreed. I never told her the truth. The Ashbridge facility appeared modern, stark glass, minimalist signage, nothing outwardly suspicious. But its blueprints told a different story, foundations older than the building itself. Buried vaults marked historical access denied. We posed as preservation researchers, requesting access to the subterranean levels. We were denied. But a week later, someone left a set of keys in our motel mailbox. No note, no explanation. Only a word etched into the plastic tag. Cradle. That night, we descended through a rear utility stairwell into what should have been a sealed section of the facility. We passed havoc systems, storage rooms, low-lit hallways. Then we found the door. Black iron. Reinforced. The same radial sigil carved across its face. We opened it. The chamber beyond was nearly identical to Stillwater, circular, spiral patterned, the air thick with some scentless humidity that seemed to muffle all sound. In the center stood a vat. Steel. Tubes ran from its base into the floor. Atop it, a child's toy sat balanced, a spinning top, covered in a reddish crust. On the walls, names were scrawled. Thousands. Written in dozens of hands, ages, styles. None were full names, just first names or nicknames, the kind a caretaker might use. We turned to leave. That was when the power failed. For 7 minutes we stood in total blackness. No sound, no air movement, no exit light. Only the overwhelming sense of presence. Not footsteps, not breathing. Just the sensation that we were now inside something thinking. The lights returned. We left. We did not speak. 2 weeks later, I learned my friend had gone missing. Her phone was found in her apartment. Her work laptop had been wiped. The last message I received from her was a single photograph of the Ashbridge stairwell. The spiral etched into the wall had grown longer. As of this writing, 6 more Foundation-linked facilities have closed abruptly. Their buildings sold or condemned. All archival records rerouted through Lucent Benevolence Trust. The pattern is accelerating. And then came the letter. Delivered by courier, no return address. The envelope sealed with wax. Inside, a single page, handwritten, with the Foundation's crest printed in faded ink. You came looking for a story, but stories end. This does not. You have been seen. The Cradle remembers, and it hungers. I have left instructions for all of my research to be released upon my disappearance or death. A full dossier has been duplicated and stored in a non-US jurisdiction, but I do not believe that will stop them. This is not a scandal. It is a machine, fed by generations, hidden beneath schools, chapels, clinics, disguised by charity and light and care. The Lowell Foundation was never just a family. It was an organ, a pulsing structure of belief, ritual, and extraction, one that fed something that did not die, only waited. Stillwater was the first mouth. There are others. The spiral is not just a symbol. It is a map, and it ends where it began, inside you.